There we go. All right. You can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Okay, that's wonderful. Right. Let me just set my stopwatch here. Okay, there we go. Well, thank you. We are generally thrilled that you would have us back so soon. But truth be told, we're also a fair bit annoyed. We are annoyed because it feels like Groundhog Day. For years, discussions around teacher education for social studies in Germany have been stuck in a loop. We've heard the same arguments, the challenges, the advantages, time and time again. So we feel it is high time we breathe some fresh life into this old conversation. And our aim today is to enrich the debate with new arguments grounded both in theory and empirical evidence. And from there, we'll offer suggestions for how to improve teacher education for social studies. Now, don't expect revolutionary insights or radical departures from common sense, especially for those of you who are deeply familiar with the subject. But we believe that when you propose meaningful changes in teacher education, you'd better back them up with solid reasoning, and that's what we are here, well, frankly, what I am here to do today. You can see the outline. So let's kick it off with some facts and figures on social studies in Germany. As you've probably imagined, it is an interdisciplinary school subject that brings together geography, history, and civics, and the subject has existed for well over half a century and is currently part of the curriculum in 12, probably soon to be 13, of our federal states. The amount of classroom time that is allocated to social studies varies significantly, not only between federal states, but also across different school types within the same state. But probably most importantly, this is not a niche subject we're talking about. Around 20% of all students in Germany attend some form of social studies classes each year. And since its inception in the early 1970s, social studies has been a hotbed of political and didactical debate. Rather than bringing you one single definition of interdisciplinary teaching and learning, we've synthesized two widely accepted definitions and arrived at four core elements. At its heart lies a complex issue or problems that is considered too multifaceted, too elaborate to be adequately addressed by any single subject. Hence, the integration of two, and in the case of social studies, three, disciplinary perspectives becomes necessary. And you might think all of that sounds perfectly good, perfectly reasonable. So why then do we think that interdisciplinary teacher education for social studies needs a serious rethink? Well, here are 5 key reasons why. While it is widely accepted that interdisciplinary learning holds the potential to deepen student understanding, that potential doesn't just magically unlock itself, it requires deliberate support. And even after more than 50 years, there's still a glaring lack of systematic teacher education, or even professional development for that matter, specifically tailored to interdisciplinary teaching. And as a consequence, we are left with a situation where out-of-field teaching is not the exception, but the norm. And understandably, this raises concerns about the impact of out-of-field teaching on instructional quality and teacher professionalism, usually leading to one of two responses. That's your two number 5s on the roadmap. Some advocate for disintegration, i.e. splitting social studies back into its component disciplines, and others call for improvement of teacher education. And just like that, we find ourselves back at square one and probably at a dead end. You may have noticed that I emphasized the word potential, and that is because, empirically speaking, we are still as far away from an open and shut case of how out-of-field teaching and social studies affects outcomes as we can be. Many arguments are based more on plausible assumptions rather than solid data. And that is probably because at the heart of this discussion lies a larger, seemingly fundamental question. Is it better to teach social studies as an integrated subject or as individual subjects? And at first glance, again, this seems like a meaningful question, but it quickly runs into problems. Because trying to causally link student achievement to structural organizations of subjects rarely produces useful insights. And that is because beneath the surface, there are many ways to implement interdisciplinary curricula. So we must be careful not to compare apples with oranges, or as the German saying goes, apples with pears. Attempts to make such comparisons tend to come from the natural sciences and have not shown consistent patterns in either direction. And for more on this, I refer you to Ariane and my latest article, in German, of course. And frankly, the lack of significant differences shouldn't come as a surprise, because research on instruction quality has long shown that deep structures such as classroom management or cognitive activation are more influential on learning outcomes than surface structures like group work or indeed how subjects are grouped under one roof. This leads us back to the old question to which we would like to provide some new arguments. What do teachers need in order to teach social studies? So what we're going to do is we're going to revisit some familiar themes, the central role of teacher competencies, the prevalence of out-of-field teaching, and, as we've just heard before, the importance of collaboration across disciplinary boundaries. However, this time, we enrich these threads with new theoretical and empirical perspectives, leading to suggestions for rethinking teacher education, as is our aim. Now, to be perfectly clear from the get-go, we're not presenting a full curriculum here. Think of this presentation more of taking a step back in order to take 2 steps forward. And on the following slides, you will see 2 icons presented on the right-hand side, a light bulb for theoretical arguments and a chart for empirical findings. Well, given the context, I think I can dispense with a lengthy definition of what constitutes out-of-field teaching. I think we're all aware there's a more narrow definition and a broader definition, especially when it comes to integrated subjects. The idea of specialization, near and far misalignment, becomes more relevant. But I brought you just one telling example, one statistics from Germany. The table on the right-hand side shows the percentage of out-of-field teachers in Gesellschaftslehre, so that's one name for social studies, in a single German state, North Rhine-Westphalia. And what you can see highlighted in yellow over there is that more than 22% of teachers assigned to this subject held, that is in 23 and 24, no formal qualification in either history, geography, or civics. I usually let that number simmer for a moment or two, more than 22%. Now, it comes as no surprise that criticism of interdisciplinary subjects often points to inadequate teacher preparation. And yes, there is no denying that teacher education in Germany falls short in this area. But it would be a mistake to treat teachers as the only source of knowledge in the classroom. A wide range of in and out of school opportunities to learn shape student achievement. And moreover, attribution theory reminds us that success or failure is often influenced by factors outside teachers' control. Having said that, the significance of teachers in promoting student achievement remains substantial. John Hattie's widely cited meta-analysis shows that out of all educational influences, if you group them together and excluding specific teaching strategies at this point, the teacher factor still has the largest overall impact on student learning, albeit by a very narrow margin. So with this in mind, one might assume that out-of-field teaching, by definition, teaching without proper qualification, would have clearly negative effects. Yet when we look at the empirical evidence in social studies, the picture is anything but clear. Compared to subjects like maths or German, we still know surprisingly little, again, how out-of-field teaching affects social studies. Most studies do indeed report negative effects on either students or teachers, but these effects tend to be inconsistent and relatively small. Now again, this does not mean that qualifications are irrelevant, but from a strictly empirical standpoint, there's no overwhelming evidence at this point to suggest that out-of-field teaching in social studies is disastrous, at least not as disastrous as one would have assumed. What is troubling is how little we still know even after decades of teaching the subject. Now, let us now shift from teaching to learning. What happens when teachers themselves become learners, especially in unfamiliar subjects? From the perspective of let me start that sentence again. From the perspective of constructivist learning theory, acquiring knowledge in a new area is less about absorbing facts and more about navigating individual pathways shaped by prior knowledge and personal beliefs, and we'll come back to beliefs later on. This becomes especially relevant in so-called ill-structured domains like social studies, where knowledge is not linear or hierarchical, but to speak metaphorically, woven together through overlapping threads, side alleys, and the occasional dead end. And that is because learners almost never start with a blank slate. As civics teachers might already be interested in, say, the history of parliamentary systems. Geography and history teachers work with maps all the time. And according to constructivist theory, new learning always interacts with existing conceptions, preconceptions, or prior theories. And ideally, this leads to a conceptual change, a deeper, more coherent understanding, but simply confronting naive beliefs with correct facts is hardly ever effective. Otherwise, we wouldn't have to deal with conspiracy theories the world over. And this is also why structural models for interdisciplinary learning unfold in stages, gradually building bridges between existing and new knowledge structures. And of course, we can't talk about improving teacher education without talking about teacher professionalism. As we've just seen through both Hattie's analysis and the very limited evidence on out-of-field teaching in social studies, teachers' competencies in the classic sense, of course, still matter. But constructivist theory reminds us that when teachers are asked to engage with unfamiliar subject matter, their existing beliefs, here they come again, also play a critical role. And especially, there are more types of beliefs, but especially two types of belief, namely epistemic beliefs, the beliefs about the nature of knowledge and how it is constructed, and also beliefs about one's professional identity. These beliefs influence whether and how, that's the one for identity, these beliefs influence whether and how teachers are willing to venture beyond disciplinary comfort zones. Now, this is another aspect that hardly needs any explanation in this context, but I'm going to dive into it anyway. That is boundary crossing theory. Because when teachers step into unfamiliar territory, which is, by the way, exactly why we titled, that is, Ariane and I, our latest article after the old Roman phrase, hic sunt dracones, there be dragons, they don't just encounter new content. They also confront sociocultural discontinuities and conflicting epistemic cultures, as described in boundary crossing theory. Now, whether these differences are integrated or resisted depends, at least in part, on teachers' professional identity. And I brought you this, I think, rather wonderful quote from Grossman and Studolsky that reads, "If high school teachers are well socialized into traditional disciplines, they may be less likely to consider the content negotiable, more likely to protect the boundaries of their subjects, and less likely to engage in interdisciplinary experimentation, pretty much like an old Roman centurion out patrolling the borderlands." And I'm not entirely sure if this is an internationally recognized theory, but at least in Germany it is an important one. From a biographical perspective on teacher professionalization, teaching inevitably involves transitions. For example, having studied civics, but being asked to teach geography. It also involves disruptions, such as being suddenly asked and assigned to teach out of field. These are not errors to be corrected, but realities to be navigated. And as I've just hinted, professional identity isn't just a label. It can be a motivator for agency, the ability and willingness to pursue learning opportunities beyond one's formal expertise. And that connection between identity and agency is crucial for understanding teacher development in interdisciplinary settings. Unfortunately, both empirical studies and the recent review from Australia show discouraging results. Because they suggest that pre-service and in-service programs rarely engage with teachers' epistemic beliefs or indeed identity development. One study, as you can see there by Bush and colleagues, that's the German study, found that fewer than 8% of social studies teachers in one of our federal states identified as teachers for that particular subject. And the separate analysis by colleague Monika Oberle and myself to appear in our edited forthcoming volume reveals a dual problem. There's a general lack of professional development for out-of-field teachers, and existing programs almost never address epistemology or identity. And the recent report, that's the one I mentioned, a recent report from Australia, seems to reach the same conclusion. And as we've seen during the presentation before, collaboration seems to be important as well, because the knowledge, skills, and beliefs required to teach social studies do exist within schools, just not in a single person. And this is where the concept of distributed expertise comes into play. The idea that expertise can be shared across different groups of teachers or even students and other personnel rather than be concentrated in one individual. Now, cooperation isn't just a skill, it is a critical condition for interdisciplinary teaching, both as a prerequisite for teachers on the one hand and as an outcome for students on the other. And yet, cooperation is often the first casualty of time pressure, autonomy, and institutional inertia. According to the expectancy value model of motivation, teachers are more likely to engage in collaboration when two things are true. They believe they are capable of succeeding in the task, that is the task of cooperating, and they place a high value on the task, be it intrinsic, utility-based, or indeed identity-based, so if cooperation aligns with teachers' core beliefs. And the last point, the attainment value tied to identity, once again highlights the role of identity in interdisciplinary teaching. While teachers technically enjoy a great deal of autonomy, this autonomy can actually inhibit meaningful cooperation. According to self-determination theory, motivation to collaborate depends on the fulfillment of three basic needs: competence, relatedness, and of course, autonomy. And herein lies the paradox. The more complex and structured cooperative efforts become, the less likely teachers are to pursue it. And unfortunately, again, this is supported by two large-scale studies of German teachers. Now, this leads us to our 7 suggestions for improving interdisciplinary teacher education. We've distilled the theoretical and empirical arguments so far into those 7 suggestions for improving teacher education for social studies in Germany and perhaps even beyond. Now, first and foremost, I think we need to develop a multi-criterial measure for out-of-field in social studies. Because while the dichotomous differentiation of out-of-field versus in-field may serve a useful purpose in educational statistics, it fails to capture the complex and diverse qualifications teachers bring to the table. So building on the concepts of specializations and near and far misalignment, we argue for a more nuanced set of criteria to assess the actual degree of out-of-fieldness in social studies, because how we define the out-of-field status shapes everything that follows, including how we interpret its effects. And speaking of effects, I think it wouldn't go amiss to recognize, but not overestimate, the impact of out-of-field teaching, because even the most refined measure of teaching qualification can only explain so much. Repeated findings from large-scale assessments remind us that the socioeconomic background in prior achievement are among the most powerful predictors for student performance. At the very least, this is the case in Germany. And there are a number of what we call them prerequisites that one might want to include in that we learn from interdisciplinary teaching and that we might want to include into teacher education. Now, first off, subjects like social studies are ill-structured by nature, and expecting teachers to master every detail of each constituent discipline is unrealistic. So instead, what's needed is the ability to navigate complex knowledge landscapes flexibly and adaptively. That is the idea of cognitive flexibility. And teachers, as I've explained, often enter learning with interests or partial understandings of adjacent subjects, and these are not obstacles, they're starting points. Identifying and addressing these preconceptions or prior theories can facilitate learning across disciplinary boundaries. And since we argue that beliefs drive agency, teacher education must go beyond content and methods and didactics, and those programs should actively engage teachers' epistemologies and professional identities. And lastly, there is strength in numbers. Shared teaching responsibility can alleviate pressure and enhance instructional quality, provided that cooperative structures, as we've heard before, are introduced early on and without requiring complete curricular overhaul. In this case, small structural nudges can yield long-term benefits. So, what's next? What is next? This is what we'd like to ask you, both as colleagues and as representatives of your respective educational systems. Do you think that our theoretical and empirical arguments hold up to scrutiny in your eyes? And what can we learn from your system? What does teacher education for social studies, if such a subject exists in your countries, look like? And what insights or cautionary tales might we take home? Thank you very much.